So we wanted to really mirror that character of kind of ground floor commercial with other uses above, primarily residential, perhaps office space, to understand really what we should be aiming for and if we were on target. For the board's benefit, there are, from our analysis here, everything in purple is a property that does have ground floor commercial space. Some of them are solely one-story commercial spaces, but I'll talk about that a little bit in a second. So we did study 16 parcels that had commercial space within the immediate vicinity, and there's 28 spaces within those 16 parcels. So some parcels do accommodate multiple different commercial spaces. Our average area per commercial space is a little over 1,300 square feet. So the commercial spaces do range pretty substantial in nature. When we take a look at specifically mixed use structure, so ground floor commercial with residential above, the average commercial space is a little over 1,000 square feet, sorry. And then the median commercial space for the area studied is 946 square feet, whereas we are proposing a commercial area of 900 feet. Again, this isn't an aspect of the project that we need any kind of relief from, but I did think it was important for the board to know, to just be aware of kind of the scale and the combination of what we're proposing from a design standpoint and why we feel that this is true to the intent of the ordinance and also consistent with the character of the neighborhood. So this is just a summary. I'm not going to go through in detail with you, but of just the analysis we did of all these properties. I just thought it was worth bringing to the board's attention. I'll zoom in a tiny bit in case those numbers are small. That of the 16 parcels we studied, 9 of them actually had commercial spaces under 1,000 square feet. So I do think the 900 square feet is very appropriate and will be able to be viably marketed and have a strong presence from a tenant who can run a business successfully within that space. Especially being a corner site, I think that brings a lot of benefit in having the exposure of 2 frontages. Okay, so that I just wanted to cover based on prior feedback from the board. And then I'm going to finally kind of wrap up. I think I've gone through the variances. I want to kind of talk a little bit more from a technical planning standpoint about municipal land use law and the master plan. So as I stated, we are seeking relief from the variances I described. Oh, wait, you know what? Sorry, I have one more to go through, which is the parking
Yeah,
variance.
Mallory, I was gonna ask you about that. And specifically, I owe the mayor a giant apology because when I went through my very long opening, I neglected to mention the one improvement that she requested this entire process, which is to even though we are able to take advantage of the parking at the municipal lot, we were able to secure an agreement with the Bethany Church right across the street to provide up to 10 parking spaces on an as needed basis at all times. So I did want to include that, and I think now was a good time to say that, given that you're going to walk through the parking. And Mayor, I apologize.
Yes. So, as the board is aware from prior testimony, our requirement for the site is 25 spaces. That's contemplating a credit for 2 spaces, given that we are implementing EV spaces per state statute. 23 of those required parking spaces are associated with the residential use of the building. And we have proposed 14 spaces within the project. So there's a deficit there. Clearly, and as well as the requirement for 2 spaces for commercial use. So as Ben stated, we have secured an agreement with the church directly across the street. So this is directly across Main Street, with the ability to designate up to 10 spaces on an as-needed basis. So again, we've discussed previously through the board that the units will be deed restricted to 1 space on site. So we will not be, obviously, I think at this point with the 12 units, 2 of those spaces would be available as overflow for the tenants, but basically everyone's guaranteed a minimum of 1 space. If they seek additional parking in each unit, they will be able to utilize spaces across the street with the church, which I think not only is that a benefit that we're not going to be overbuilding parking on the site, but that we're able to utilize a shared parking approach which is really a contemporary best practice in terms of parking, traffic, and urban design. Additionally, there is a provision in the zoning code. I'm going to cite it here. It's 25-12.1.K, which actually allows that off-street parking facilities, as required, can be provided off-site for non-residential uses in the B2, provided they're provided within a property that's within 250 feet of the principal building. So we do comply with that in terms of the distance from our building to the property across the street. So we do satisfy compliance in terms of the commercial parking. So really what we're looking at now is a deficit of 8 spaces on site for the residential use, whereas we have, a deficit of 9 spaces on site for the residential use, where we have an availability of up to 8 additional spaces across the street. So ultimately that meant if every single tenant wanted 2 spaces and the commercial employees wanted to use parking as well, the overall deficit for the project is now 1 space, which I think is very reasonable within the mixed use typology. And I also think is consistent with some standards of the master plan, which I'll talk about a little bit later. Okay, thank you for bearing with me all. I know this is long testimony, but I think the project is really unique, and the condition of not having the bulk standards flushed out fully within the zoning for our use is kind of creating some additional explanation here. Okay, so the kind of technical planning aspects, I want to talk about really how we're advancing the purposes of municipal land use law. I think we're advancing several purposes with the project. One of the major ones being that we will promote a more desirable visual environment through creative development techniques consistent with purpose I. I do believe that the property as it stands obviously is vacant, it's overgrown, and redevelopment in any manner is going to be an improvement for the property, but particularly with an active mixed use building fronting onto the Main Street corridor, directly adjacent to a bus stop, and compatible with the other smaller scale commercial spaces within the neighborhood. So I do believe that we're contributing to a better walking environment, a better pedestrian realm, and an improved kind of vitality from a public realm perspective. I also think that we are, really promoting general welfare consistent with purpose A. We have provided what we believe is an appropriately scaled mixed-use building that really contemplates the transition from the commercial zone to the lower scale residential behind us, which I think is fully aligned with the intention of the B2 district. And I also think establishes appropriate population densities and concentrations consistent with purpose E. In terms of the negative criteria for the variances, I don't think that the granting of the variances will result in a substantial detriment to general welfare. The project does propose to improve, as I said, a currently vacant property and bring substantial stormwater management improvements to the site. The variances likewise will not result in substantial impairment to the intent and purpose of the zone plan. Hopefully that exercise of us really taking an extra step to understand what the township has contemplated as appropriate from the standpoint of this use shows the board that this was really a thoughtful approach to the project, and that there's a rhyme and a reason for why the bulk in front of you exists tonight. And clearly we're consistent with the intent of the ordinance as we are meeting all of the provisions of the conditional use as stipulated in the code. In terms of the master plan, I do believe that we are advancing several goals and objectives of the 2019 master plan. The first being objective 9, which is to promote a desirable visual environment. I think I also kind of covered that in the purposes of municipal land use law. Objective 11 is to encourage economic development, redevelopment, and rehabilitation in downtown and other commercial areas compatible with character of the township. I think we kind of provided the analysis that we have done that. Objective 13 is to improve and maintain existing residential neighborhoods. As stated, I think the mixed use typology is perfect for this corner because it is a transition property. And so we're really taking a balanced approach to the development of the site. Whereas a purely commercial build out of this site might not be the best relationship to have next to that lower density residential neighborhood behind us. Additionally, principle 1 is to encourage appropriate residential development. The master plan states this can vary in different locations and contexts throughout the township. In particular, mixed-use development that includes family residential is appropriate in various commercial districts and other developed location within the township. So I think, again, the project really accomplishes that principle and satisfies that principle and overall development objectives. And other recommendations include permitting mixed-use development and multifamily residential in certain business districts and other focus areas. As far as our parking goes, I just want to offer that the master plan does have several recommended changes for the township to consider. These are pulled from page 29 for your benefit. Some of the recommended changes include change parking minimum standards, particularly for downtown and the valley, as well as mixed-use development. Another is to review and modify standards for mixed-use development, particularly for downtown settings. Permit mixed-use development and multifamily residential in certain business districts and look to changes of said parking standards to provide more flexibility in terms of parking ratios and evaluate mixed-use development for shared parking standards. So again, I think we're really accomplishing and advancing several goals of the master plan. I think we have a project before you that really strongly achieves a successful mixed-use typology at a scaled approach. Again, which I think is the intent of allowing this conditional use. We hope that we've given the board some good food for thought in how to maybe advance the zoning one step further as you work through what this conditional use means for your commercial districts. And I do believe, as stated, that the variances are reasonable and can be granted. I do believe that the benefits of the project as a whole substantially outweigh the detriments.
Thank you, Mallory. Just a couple of follow-up questions, if that's okay. So one of the things, so one of the things that you touched on, and I think you used Harold Maltz's foundational testimony regarding the trip generation for a site like this, and he had indicated on the record and in his report that for the residential component, at least, knowing that we know what it is, it would be approximately 5 to 6 trips in the peak hour. And I know that was explained in detail, but you compared this mixed use to the more typical permitted uses within the B2 retail zone. And I believe Mr. Maltz did that as well to some degree. And would you agree, as a professional planner, that by creating this neighborhood commercial space within a residential district, you're significantly enhancing the safety and the general atmosphere as opposed to one of those typical retail uses?
Yes, so I would say that I think that the use as proposed and the parking count as proposed will create substantially less disruption to the sidewalk from an ingress and egress standpoint. For reference, the two kind of traditional quote B2 properties closest to us are a gas station and a Dunkin' Donuts, which are very obviously traffic intensive uses. So a use like that would be permitted use on our site, but I think the traffic generation and then the impacts on the pedestrian environment and the impacts on just the influx of cars on the adjacent roadways would be more substantial with those uses than what we're proposing tonight.
Okay. You also mentioned right at the beginning of your testimony that this is a unique site, both with respect to topography, its location on a corner, the way it slopes, the nature of the uses surrounding it on Main Street and then behind. As a planner, part of your job is obviously to review not just the master plan, but the zoning ordinance, which obviously was changed to include conditional uses, mixed uses as conditional uses within the B2 zone. Do you believe, again, as a professional planner, that this is the type of site that merits this type of use, again, as opposed to a more typical permitted use that comes with its own, as we've heard over the course of 4 hearings, substantial concerns?
Yes, so as I think I touched on a little bit, this is a unique commercial property in that we are very much a transition to a lower scale, lower density, lower scale residential zone. And so I think, zoning codes aren't perfect and they're not written for our particular special piece of land. That's why this board exists, right? So I think you can't capture those transitions, in totality. parcel by parcel. And so to me, part of the intent behind contemplating this mixed use conditional use was likely to help acknowledge these transitions between the commercial zones and residential zones throughout the town. And so I do think that this is an appropriate, it is an ideal site. We meet the critical criteria that you look at when you're evaluating a site for kind of a mix of uses, which would be a minimum lot area. We are well in excess of what the zone, what the conditional use contemplates. We can accommodate sound urban design principles on site in terms of putting a quality commercial space that has a well-designed egress point that's accessible and inviting to the public, where a business could thrive and a resident would know it, or a passerby would know it's there. We're directly adjacent to a bus stop on a main, I mean, literally on Main Street in the town. So these are all the kinds of characteristics you look for as a planner in evaluating, land use types and appropriate land uses for a site. And I would say this is really, as highlighted in the master plan, this is really kind of like a 101 of where do we start to look at mixed use, applications and mixed use projects within the township.
Okay, thanks. And then my last question, and you kind of led right into that, regarding the negative criteria. I know you spoke significantly about the positives and the consistency with the master plan and the general scheme of what Main Street's looking for. With regard to the negative criteria, you went over this, that there's no substantial impairment to the zone plan. I think your testimony was really the opposite, that this, falls in line with the overall zone plan. With respect to substantial detriment, you did hit on some things like we've stepped back the building at the upper floors. Some of those setbacks are really only relevant at the ground level to accommodate that parking area. So, if you can speak a little bit to how, this will not create substantial detriment to the public good.
Yeah, and I think that was also part of just kind of that setback analysis we did of other properties on the street, and that we're not proposing a condition that's like wildly out of character with what exists building to building today. And again, like just at face value, those properties aren't in compliance with their zone standards either. That doesn't mean we're entitled to not comply in any way, shape, or form. But what I'm saying is the not compliance is not an anomaly within our property. And so what I really do is, as a planner and a designer, is look at what the existing context is, and are we in step with the building pattern, and that's how we start to determine, is this an appropriate amount of light and air and open space? Our relationships in this proximity as an existing condition helps us start to understand, is it going to make somebody feel like something very out of character is popping up in their neighborhood? Obviously, there are going to be impacts that's inherent with the need for the relief, but the clauses there that we all know within the way municipal land use law works is substantial detriment, and I don't believe that any of the relief we're requesting has substantially detrimental impacts. And I do believe that in several of the aspects we are mitigating those impacts either through sound design, or through additional design features such as, the green roof and stormwater detention with the coverage relief we need. So I think we've taken a balanced approach to understanding how to balance and mitigate the impacts of the relief that we need with this project.
Okay. And then my last question for you, some of this relief, especially regarding that additional half story, even though we're compliant with the height, but going at 3 stories at Main Street, perhaps also that setback from Main Street, if we complied, do you believe as a planner that activating the Main Street frontage and actually opening it up and bringing that down to grade is actually a good thing, despite the fact that it does create that additional need for variance relief?
Yes, I believe from an urban design perspective, if I were, again, in my design practice, if I were given like a blank slate site and told do some mixed use development on it, the first thing I would be doing on this property is pulling the building to the corner, anchoring that commercial space in the prime location. And again, looking at the existing context. So directly across the street from us, across Park Drive North to the north, is a 4-story residential building built to the property line on both frontages. So both on Main Street, both on and Park Drive North, that has ground floor commercial space. So that's actually a pre-existing building that predates this conditional use being added to the ordinance that really fulfills the intent. We are consistent. We are lower in height than that building. And we have a similarly scaled commercial space proposed. So again, I think we're keeping in step with what exists in the character of the neighborhood. while also making sure that we're really prioritizing best practices from a design and development standpoint.
Thank you. Chairman, that would conclude my direct examination of Ms. Clark.
Thank you. Great. Thank you, Ms. Clark. So we'll go to the members of the planning board. Vice Chairman Garino, do you have any questions for Ms. Clark on her testimony?
Second, Mr. Chair, I gotta look at my notes over here a second. If someone was to ask you one simple question, what would you think is one thing out of this proposal, any specific, entity of this proposal, would you say with something that would be a negative to the thought process of accepting this project? I won't hold you to it. I just want your opinion, if that's allowed to be asked.
Can you reword that question or just clarify that question for me a little bit in terms of what you mean by are you asking me to identify negative, or are you asking
if you were one of us, if I can ask, and Mr. Wine, correct me, and Ms. McGovern, correct me if I can't ask this, but if you were me, if I can ask, and you were listening to your testimony and going through all the specifics, is there anything that would really pop out and say that this could be, an item that would really, put a damper on this project?
So, Mr. Vice Chair, can I reword your question, I think, in a way that
Sure.
Ms. Clark might be able to answer? And you can correct me if it's not what you're asking. But Mallory, I guess the question is, you gave substantial testimony, not just about the relief, but the mitigative techniques. So to the Vice Chairman's point, is there anything you see through the genesis of this project that, could be seen as a negative that we've not, I guess, Vice Chair, that we've not been able to mitigate adequately, whether it's through stormwater detention, through stepping back the building in areas where there's anything like that?
That's exactly right, Mr. Wine. Thank you, sir.
Okay, so what I would identify as a response to that, I think there's kind of like two parts to it. So just from identifying the response to that, I think in an ideal version of the world, we might have a slightly different amount of breathing room or step back from the lower scale residential behind us. I think that is driven from a design perspective by trying to get as close to our required parking ratio as we possibly can. So that sets the floor plate of the building, right? So if we were to take, it's a balancing of priorities, and we have heard, and we believed, and we have heard that providing parking to relieve demand that might exist, then kind of fall out to the on-street parking, if we were to be short, was a priority. And so, we took this approach to the building of trying to accommodate the most reasonable parking configuration we could on the site, which necessitates a bigger building footprint. This is a very common problem that I'm sure this board has heard umpteen times before, which is, parking is a big driver of site configuration, particularly when, the master plan calls for kind of altered standards in a mixed use development, but that's not been adopted from a zoning standpoint. So, it would be lovely if parking weren't either required at the degree it were, or were less of a priority, which varies greatly from community to community. As an urban designer and a planner, I'm very pro transit and pro mass transit philosophy to development. So that would be like a change I would love to see be made, but it wouldn't necessarily bring the project more in compliance with the code overall.
Thank you, Ms. Clark. Thank you, Mr. Wan. I appreciate thank you very much. That's enough. That's all for me, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Garino. Mayor McCartney, do you have any questions for Ms. Clark on the testimony?
Thank you, Chairman. Ms. Clark, thank you so much for all of the testimony on compliance and actually explaining non-compliance on all of the issues. I wanted to actually thank and appreciate Benjamin Wine, recognizing the fact that it's obvious the board has been trying to work with you, and you accepting all of these modifications that we made or have suggested. And of course, bringing up the parking issues. So I never really did follow the math that was presented to us. So I'm glad to hear that you have that agreement with the Bethany Church. But that raises an issue for me because though I didn't think that the residents would walk to the 16 spaces, the permit parking over at the municipal lot, it really did seem so far away. It really would be more pedestrian safe. It would be safer for pedestrians because that's where the light is and that's where the crosswalks are. Now, though it's great that you have this agreement, there is no crosswalk. And now you're encouraging people to cross across the street, right around the bend of Main Street. That raises another issue for me. And now I don't know if that goes to the county. And I'm still concerned about the people that live on the road behind you. Though we would issue them all parking permits to be there. You talked about when our planner asked you to swap the trash and lobby sections. And I'm still curious to know, is it possible to swap the entrance and exit of the building itself, where people would actually just be able to exit on the left instead of the right and have to go up and around the street? Has that ever been considered?
Mayor, to be clear, you're talking about, I mean, to exit onto the neighboring property.
No. The way the exit is right now, you would have to go up and around the street. I'm trying to keep you off the street and to come directly out on Main Street.
So I don't know if Mallory can answer that. I can certainly answer that question. To come directly onto Main Street, first of all, there's obviously the bus stop there. Second of all, being the county elements, you know, Harold had indicated there's a safety concern with that. And, you know, even though the garage door is something that is anticipated to be able to go up and down in a matter of, I think he said 3 to 4 seconds. And we're talking about one car, as we said, every 10 to 12 minutes. Having that element on Main Street would pose a safety problem. You really don't want cars even slowing down to turn into, at a 90-degree turn, into a parking garage on Main Street. And that's something that I think was a concern there. You know, in a perfect world, just given our orientation, the Park Drive loop, I mean, in theory, would be reversed, and you would come in through the other side and you would exit, you know, basically make a right out of our site, right onto basically right onto Main Street to alleviate that out. But that's not the case. And obviously, given that we have a property next to us, we can't really exit onto their property. So thought was given to that. I think it's always, from a design perspective, and again, speaking for the engineer, it's always easier to pose an entrance and exit at a grade, which would be on Main Street rather than on the slope that is Park Drive. But to do that would create safety concerns that would far exceed, again, when we're talking about in the peak hour, one vehicle every 10 to 12 minutes.
Yeah,
Right,
and
so
Ben, just from
that-
kind of a planning and public safety standpoint, I would just echo that looking quickly at the site. That one of the main challenges from a configuration standpoint is that we would really need a substantial setback from the corner itself before we could even think about implementing a curb cut. And by the time we get to that clear distance, we're in the bus zone. So it's additional disruption, additional coordination. You know, we couldn't even guarantee that we could get that accomplished because we would obviously have to get permission in coordination with NJ Transit, but it also just from a geographical standpoint on the site is not as simple, as it sounds to just switch that egress point.
And Mayor, the one thing I'll add as well is, regarding your comment as to walking across to the Bethany Church, that's why I think the master plan has discussed alternative parking numbers and not being at 2 spaces per unit in a mixed use building, which I think everyone has recognized is in 1 and 2 bedroom apartments, not necessarily what 2024 and beyond would need. So by striking that balance of providing a minimum of 1-to-1 on the site. I think you eliminate the risk of that by also providing the option for parking still in that municipal lot. That doesn't go away. That remains
Mhm,
an
mhm.
option. And somebody would have the option, if they had a second vehicle, to say, to turn to my client and say, I'd like it in the Bethany Church, or I'd like it at the municipal lot. I mean, both are options. It's not one or the other. And then lastly, as you see on Main Street, there are a couple of locations further north and further south that have crosswalks. That's something we have no issue petitioning for. I can't guarantee it. I think it would actually be an intelligent thing to do at this location, especially when you have a church in the vicinity. There are people who may go to the church on a weekly basis and park on this side of the street and kind of, I hate to suggest they might jaywalk, but that's a thing that may occur. So I think that petitioning for a crosswalk is a good idea. I just can't guarantee it. But when you weigh up all of those options, I think there's a lot of good in there.
And all of the things that Ms. Clark referenced too about the zoning recommendations, they are all going to be looked at by our planners about the parking. Plus, we are also looking at proposing an ordinance. If you looked at that list of all the commercial areas all of the commercial spaces that you had in the area, we are looking at an ordinance to limit the number of nail salons and hair salons. Either, by distancing them or just limiting the number. So that is another concern if you do recruit businesses for your retail space. So I am concerned about that crosswalk because we did have a pedestrian get hit yesterday and was taken to the hospital for doing exactly that, crossing over mid-block. So I would really propose that you look at talk to the county about, or pedestrian safety people I know are on this call too. What is the likelihood of having a crosswalk mid-block there?
Sure.
Okay, thank you, Mayor McCartney. Council
Thank
President
you.
Rutherford, do you have any questions for Ms. Clark on the testimony?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Ms. Clark, for your testimony. I do have a few questions. I'll stay
Sure.
with the parking theme. So I think I read, and I was looking for it. I couldn't find it. I think there are 23 spaces required at this site. Is that right? Or is it, how many parking spaces are required?
25. It's 25.
25.
20 are required for the residential use specifically. And then the additional 2 are associated with the commercial use requirements.
So 25 total, and then you have 12.
14.
You have 14. So even with the 10 across the street, it's less than what the code would recommend.
It's short one space, yes.
The 10 spaces across the street, how would that, and this may not be for you, but how would that impact the existing permit parking in that lot? Aren't those spots already?
So that I can answer that. I don't know that Ms. Clark can get there. I've had extensive conversation, and I mentioned this to Ms. McGovern last month. I'm just going to be careful about attorney-client privilege with respect to speaking to the attorney for the church. So I'll just be careful with that. But I will say that what I can put on the record is we have confirmed that the up to 10 spaces we'd be looking for would have no conflict with whatever other arrangements they may have on their site. That's what we negotiated. There's still some final tweaks to be made, but that's the answer to the question. I don't know what other permits may be there, but it would not impact our ability to have up to 10 parking spaces.
So the additional overflow parking that's proposed at Bethany Church, as the mayor just mentioned a moment ago, would require folks to cross Main Street, which is 4 lanes at that location. Are we aware of the lighting for folks that might be traveling across that road at night?
I don't know, Mallory, do you know the answer to that?
Just give me 1 second, bear with me. I'm just looking in Google Earth right now and Street View to see. So directly across from our property, if you're, familiar with the general area, there's a series of billboards.
Mhm.
Directly across from our property, there's a street light in front of those billboards. So it's essentially a couple of feet south of the intersection. There is a street light. Similarly, across moving, like if you were to walk across Park Drive North and then cross directly from there, there's a street light there as well. So there is substantial lighting. It looks to be, I'm not going to call it historic, but it's kind of more pedestrian scaled lighting in character, in addition to the street lights on the for the roadway itself, like the cartway itself, that are on the utility poles. So there's 3 lamps, and actually, you know what, for the benefit, let me share my screen just so I can be clear for the record here. So Ms. McGovern, for the purposes of the record, I am sharing Google Earth Pro Street View in front of the subject property. The imagery is dated June of 2023.
Okay, we're gonna mark this as A3, and I'm gonna ask you to do a screen capture and send
Sure, I'll do a
that
series.
as well.
I'll do a series. Send them, yeah.
Mallory, I'm glad
so-
you know how to do that because that's so beyond my technical ability.
Let me share here. Can you all see?
Not
Yeah.
yet.
Oh, I see. My- How about now?
Yes.
Yes. Okay, so this is looking at the subject property from Main Street. So, as the board is aware, this is the previous building that's no longer on the property. And if we look to the site here, this is looking north. So this is the property directly across Park Drive North. So if you look on the right side of the screen, you'll see a series of pedestrian scaled lights directly across from the property. There's another one right here. So there's 3 lights across from this property, as well as the street lighting you can see coming from the utility poles along the cartway. I don't think there's one on this pole, although there may be. It's a little blurry here. And there is one on the next utility pole. So I would say there is substantial lighting for the evenings for pedestrians, which I think is proven here within the street view by the notion of the fact that these are bus stops. So they're generally well-lit areas.
Could you show us the other corner? It's where the gas station.
Sure. You mean further down here?
No, yeah, right there. So that's where people would be crossing. Right, because
This corner.
the that's the church in the background there, and the parking lot is right there. So do we have any lighting on that corner?
There is street cartway lighting. There's not a pedestrian scaled pole there. But there's a street cartway lighting on either side of the intersection.
All right, and so my concern here is that at any time of day, because as the mayor mentioned, we did have a pedestrian get struck by a vehicle yesterday, had to shut down the street in order to address that situation, and that was during the middle of the day. My concern is that with a 4-lane roadway, and even at night with that one light, which is probably 20 feet off of the corner, it's not well lit. You're going to have folks crossing that street, and I do think that would pose some safety issues. We are a Vision Zero town. We agreed to the township council supported the mayor in becoming and subscribing to Vision Zero. Our pedestrian safety advisory board has remarked multiple times about Main Street, the difficulty for folks to cross that street, and with it being a 4-lane highway, regardless of what the posted speed limit is, we have outside of rush hour, we have people frequently speeding. So I think that does not adequately, I think it poses additional risks for potential residents to park at the church and then cross back across that street. Is certainly at night, but obviously at any time of day. So that is a concern of mine, and I don't know how that would be addressed, even with a crosswalk, possibly with better lighting, certainly with some other traffic control mechanisms there. And I don't know if that would actually help us or if it would make traffic worse. So I just think that is a bad or a challenging corner to present this type of solution with these other issues there. So just, that's my concern with your proposed solution for the parking. Can you also walk me through, and I want to thank you for the slides you showed us with regard to the variances you're looking for. You spoke about the size of the lot. Can you just give me that again? I took notes as well as I could. I think one setback was 5 feet, but it required 30 feet, and I may have gotten that wrong. Can you walk me through
Yes.
that again?
Yeah, so the standards of the B2 district, again, which are written contemplating just commercial development, not mixed use development. The front yard requirement of the zone is 30 feet. The rear yard requirement of the zone is 30 feet, and the side yard requirement of the zone is 10 feet.
Right. And so, and this is a 5 foot.
Correct. This is a 5 foot side yard, a 5 foot front yard. And again, I think we kind of covered why we believe that, especially with the mixed use nature and the corner of property nature, why pulling the building up to the pedestrian realm at Main Street is a better design alternative. The rear yard setback is it varies. The pinch point of which is at the northwestern corner of the property, and that is at about 8.5 feet. Where the 30 is required on the zone. One thing I would also just offer for your consideration in that is that because of the way the zoning ordinance defines these yards, it's not fully baked. I would like call it as a term for corner property. You do acknowledge the side front yard condition, which is really, on the corner property, you have like a main frontage and then your kind of secondary frontage. But from a lot configuration standpoint, typically in zoning ordinances, as the board knows, the typical arrangement is that your shorter property line is going to be your lot width, right? And then your longer property line is going to be your lot depth. Typically, lots are organized in zoning such that they are deeper than they are wide. So, for example, a typical configuration might be 2,500 square foot lot with 25 feet of frontage and 100 feet of lot depth. Because of our corner property condition, the configuration of what's our front yard and what's our rear yard and side yards is switched from the traditional configuration. So actually our shorter run of our property, our shorter line becomes our lot depth. So it becomes very, very, very challenging to meet that 30-foot rear yard setback in that condition. It significantly undercuts kind of our ability to really make productive use of the site. I hope that answered your question.
It does. I still think it poses some challenges, again, from a public safety standpoint. Have you considered how police officers, in a foot chase or doing any other investigation around the rear of the building, or, particularly on the southeasterly side, the rear yard, southeastern corner, because we had some presentation earlier, and again, it's been quite a while, but I believe there were some landscaping proposed in that area, which makes visibility and lighting a little challenging for police officers. Also makes access to the rear of the building for firefighters a little more challenging. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, so there's absolutely substantial ability for like emergency services to access all sides of the property. Again, I would just offer for your benefit, the condition at the rear yard, pinch points in particular, and the side yard pinch points are not inconsistent with the building to building relationship elsewhere on the street. So like I said, we're not creating like a wildly tighter condition than exists building to building. So, if that's functioning and that's not been raised as a large concern in the existing neighborhood footprint, I don't think we're going to be introducing any new condition there. Is there the ability for someone to utilize landscaping in that manner, sure, once it's mature and really grown out, and you know, it's not, obviously the board doesn't have the ability to oversee, you know, long-term maintenance and things of that nature. But given that the setback isn't super generous on that property line, you know, we've scaled the landscaping accordingly. So we have kind of more narrow growing plants that are more vertical based. They don't have wide of a spread. So, you know, I think we've responded to the overall site organization with sound design and sound landscaping and planting principles. I don't think that what we're proposing will cause a safety concern, would be my ultimate answer.
My concern was more, if you look at the front of the proposed building, the retaining wall is on the south side of the building.
Mhm.
That if public safety professionals had to access that rear corner, they'd either have to come from Park Drive North and go the full width of the building around the rear, and that is the pinch point, which is at that corner, or they'd have to scale the retaining wall from Main Street and go and access the rear from that way. Either way, to me, seems to pose a safety risk for them, or to impact their ability to access the space and do the work, you know, in the case of a firefighter. Am I overthinking that?
I would just say, from a zoning perspective and a planning perspective, I don't see this as an atypical condition in a built environment. You know, these are realities of mixed use development, and just Main Street corridors, I would say, in general. So I don't think we're creating something that from my experience as a professional planner, that emergency services wouldn't know how to deal with.
Yeah, and Council President, just to that point, you know, further, especially regarding fire or things of that nature, you know, the wall exists there today. So, you know, I don't know if they've ever had to scale this wall before, but that's a condition that is only getting better, actually, by eliminating most of the wall along the frontage. And I think we had testimony, we could bring it up on the plan, how tall that wall is. It's not something that with the right equipment, you know, the fire departments have, they could not get over. And then also, one of the comments we received from the board at, I think, 2 hearings ago regarding adequately lighting the path along the rear of the building was for that exact reason, was to make sure that whether it's firefighters or police officers or anybody that needed to get in or out in an emergency would be able to do so in a well lit and appropriately graded manner.
Got it. Thank you very much for that explanation.
Yeah, and Council President, the only other thing I would say is, you know, you could always look to further cut back that wall all the way to the edge of our property line so that the wall is completely gone. You know, that's just parking space inside the building right now. But if that was something that, since we are already cutting out the vast majority of the wall, if that's something the board wanted to see, I don't see a reason why we couldn't cut off that wall, you know, throughout the entirety of our frontage.
Or provide maybe steps or something that
Or
go-
steps, yeah. I mean, I'll ask our team, but I really, if we're cutting out that much, which is about 75% of the frontage at this point, I really don't see a reason we couldn't do that or add in steps, to your point.
All right, those are my concerns. Thank you, Ms. Clark. Thank you, Mr. Wine. Mr. Chair, that's it for now. I may raise my hand again later.
Thank you, Council President. Mr. Alper, do you have any questions for Ms. Clark on her testimony?
I do, thank you. I appreciate the visual comparisons. I think they're helpful, but on the Edison and Central Valley redevelopment projects, when you showed them, the properties adjoining them, there weren't any existing single-family homes alongside those, were there?
Not to my knowledge. I'm gonna be honest, I was really analyzing the mixed use goal standard, so I didn't do like a
Gotcha.
full blown review of the entirety of the redevelopment plan. So I can't definitively say if there's single use family zoning within it. Typically that's not common that we see single family zoning within redevelopment areas. I'll put it that way.
Right. So I think for me, it makes a difference to me because, you know, it's those are kind of commercial areas. So having the, you know, the practically no setback along the street, I think it makes sense on the Edison project, for instance, in a way that it doesn't necessarily on the Park Drive North side. I know that's not, you know, no setback, but you know, where you know, it's more of a residential look and you'd expect more of a setback. I had a question on that, on the front side yard on Park Drive North. You said that was a 10-foot setback, but we have a planning review memo in the agenda, you know, in the links there that said that that was a 25-foot setback. Is it?
So to clarify, the 10-foot setback is for the side yard, which is the southern side of the property. So that's that would be happening along Main Street. The front side yard is what fronts onto Park Drive North, and that is the 25-foot requirement. Correct.
Gotcha. So where it would adjoin the next residential property, that would be a 25-foot requirement on that side.
Correct. And that was kind of in line with the analysis I provided of the step backs of the other structures on that, and where we were very consistent with the average of 7.5 feet.
I appreciate the clarification. When you were talking about the green roof offsets, and I thank you for the green roof. I think it's a help. Somebody sneezed as you were saying what the percentage was, the improvement, and I missed it. Was it 50? Was it 55, 65? I think it was one or the other.
It's 65. So that's per the study for the GSA. So they've done some studies on the benefits of green infrastructure, and in analyzing, again, this, I want to be clear that this is the benefit of green roof versus non-green roof. So it's not, you know, you're not comparing like how does green roof do compared to like a beautiful meadow with great drainage and not compacted soil and all that. This is to just how that performs in comparison to just standard rooftop. And it's a 65, their report concluded is about a 65% on average improvement in stormwater management on a site.
And from a permeable surface coverage perspective, does that allow you to change the percentage that's covered, or?
No, because the code doesn't contemplate green infrastructure as
Sure.
meeting the coverage requirement, so it doesn't change, you know, what we're actually required to do. I just think it, you know, it's a substantial consideration for the board that we are able to achieve some level of stormwater management and meet some of the intent of that requirement through other measures.
Okay. On the parking, and this part might be more for Mr. Wine. Is the use of the parking at either Bethany or the Mississippi lot, is that mandatory for people who have a vehicle that they don't have a space for in the building, or
Yeah, so what we've said, and I think the mayor mentioned it before, that she's working with the residents of Park Drive to ensure that they have permit parking along the street so that that's not taken up by our project, or quite honestly by other residents from other streets. But yes, so what we will stipulate to as a condition of approval in our leases with our proposed tenants would be that they are entitled to, with every unit comes one parking space. So that's going to be something that they have to stipulate to, and a further condition that says if they have a second vehicle, they're required to let management know, at which point management will coordinate another space either in that municipal lot or across the street at the Bethany Church. I do want to maintain, because I know the mayor and council president just brought up their concerns with across the street. You know, objectively, we said from the beginning, I think the municipal lot it's a better option, because the municipality provides it for exactly this purpose. It's why the municipality has, you know, provided parking and collects a little bit of income from parking for exactly that, and also because it doesn't require that you cross the street at an intersection without a crosswalk. We came up with this Bethany Church arrangement, you know, as a fallback option, recognizing that Mr. Maltz's testimony and your own master plan doesn't really think that there's going to be a need for 2 vehicles per unit, but that if there is, we would provide any overflow on the Mississippi lot, and if there is further, we would provide overflow within the Bethany Church. So these are fail safes, but to be honest with you, Mr. Alper, I think you would be shocked, maybe not. And I think I know if Mr. Klein was here on the board as a traffic engineer, he may agree with that we may not need any overflow parking when the building's actually leased up, because if you put a stipulation in that says you get 1 space with your lease, anything else you're required to let us know, it's somewhat self-policing.
On the topic of the parking permits for residents, am I understanding it correctly that the idea would be that existing residents would each get a certain number of parking spaces and residents of 410 would not be eligible to get those permits?
I think that's what the mayor was suggesting, but I'm not going to speak for her.
That's what I was suggesting.
Yeah, and
I
just
think
just for the board, and really not the board, but the township's consideration, I've worked with other municipalities on this exact issue. And a lot of times what they will do in multifamily buildings is say that they need a certification from, basically, like, in order to get an on-street parking permit, someone would need a certification that their apartment building's parking was at capacity. So they would have to prove to the township to secure a parking permit that there wasn't parking available. In this, you would include shared parking arrangements off-site. So it's just from a policy standpoint, it's just food for thought for you, Mayor, in developing that kind of permit restriction. Is a way to kind of reserve that parking for residents of the neighborhood versus the newer construction.
Gotcha. In a vacuum, I like the idea of the creative offsite parking options. Obviously I've got the same safety concerns as everyone else about, people going across Northfield. But I'd also worry that, if there's not a legal impediment to people parking, even if, I got groceries, I want to bring them in the building, we want to make sure that those people aren't taking up a parking spot on the residential street. If we're using permits to make sure that doesn't happen, that probably helps. Another one of my concerns is, again, not a vacuum, because it's a one-way all the way around. You may get people making an additional trip. They find a spot here and they hope, well, if I can get one down here on Park Drive South, closer to Northfield, it's less of a walk. I don't have to walk up the slope. Then there's not a spot. Then they come back again. I'm concerned for the residents for what the parking situation is. But
And I think that the permit only parking accomplishes exactly those issues. Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Alpern. Mr. Smeraldo, do you have any questions for Ms. Clark on the testimony?
Sorry, Mike was hitting the button. Sorry about that. So the good thing about going later is most of my questions have been asked and answered. So that's a good thing. But I do have the same concerns with regards to the crossing. So I'm just gonna, just state that. But the question I do have is we've talked about securing parking for the tenants, but the commercial property you mentioned before, I believe you mentioned, Ms. Clark, about 2 spots were going to be allocated to the commercial. And what are you going to do about the people who are, I understand we don't know what the occupancy is going to be, but if we anticipate there's going to be foot traffic, where do you anticipate those people parking?
So I don't think we can anticipate from a customer base. What I can tell you from like planning and zoning perspective is that what the code requires is 1 space for every 250 square feet of commercial square footage. So I think that's up to the operations long term, whether those get dedicated for patrons versus employees. I think that varies site to site, but there's no requirement within the code in terms of designating that parking either way. It's just set on a gross floor area ratio, and that's where the requirement would come from. So again, it's up to operations how they monitor and police that, throughout the life of the building.
Okay, and based on the mayor's concern about, the type of occupancies and you being a planner, what is it that you envision for that kind of building? What would you see as a optimal type of business? Is it a food establishment, grab and go coffee? Is it, a personal type service facility?
It could be a variety of things. What I could say more definitively from like a spatial standpoint is like a full service sit down restaurant is probably not going to be easily accommodated in 900 square feet. If you look at the other existing restaurant bars in the immediate neighborhood, they're all over, I think, 1,500 to 2,000 square feet per business. Understanding the mayor's concern, a lot of the businesses that are in the smaller scale vary greatly from anything from kind of like a convenience store, coffee, grab and go, as you say. There's dry cleaners, there's plenty of beauty services, a myriad of beauty services, whether it's barber, nails, hair. And there's some smaller quick bites, I would call it, food establishments. So it could be many things. Also with commercial zoning, it could be office space as well. I can't represent, what the client's intention is, but just from a spatial perspective, many things. work within.
And that's what I wasn't going to hold you to, because I know there could be many different things, but I just wanted to discuss that fact that, if it is a retail type of store, we have to worry about, the occupants, both the employees and those that are visiting. If it is more of a office space, then yeah, less people, but it is concerned that these extra spaces and where those people are going to park, and if they are going to take over spots, and we could do a what, shoulda, coulda, woulda, or what ifs all night, but I just wanted to have that brief discussion on it. So
What's
I believe.
To elaborate a little bit further is that the market usually flushes these things out inherently, in that it's a business tenant is going to be looking for certain characteristics of a space for it to work for their business model. So if it's a business that relies heavily on in and out frequent traffic, they're probably not going to pick this space. Given that they don't have a guaranteed on-site parking or a drop-off zone. So a lot of that tends to work itself out, just in the real world. But again, just from a zoning and planning perspective, as far as the code goes, the requirement is set on the square footage ratio.
And Mr. Smeraldo, I didn't want to interrupt Ms. Clark because she was on such a roll. I spoke to my client earlier, and I can confirm it would be an office space, like for an architect or an attorney. So it would be a small office space.
Okay, so we're looking at realistically 2, possibly 3 people type of thing. So I'm just trying to get a gauge of what we're looking at. That's all.
Yeah.
Nothing, and I'm not holding anybody to it, but I just want to, when you put these visions together for the future, you have to think about this kind of thing. So, and I think pretty much from a safety perspective and the parking and everything else, I think most of my colleagues here asked those questions. So I think I'm good. So thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you,
and again, I would be open, just to confirm, to stipulate again as a condition of any approval that commercial space be an office space use, because again, I can tell you anecdotally, I represent 7-Eleven on a number of cases. Like, they would never look at a site like this where they want 30 parking spaces for 7-Eleven dedicated. So they would never be an end user. It just wouldn't work. But to your concerns, which I think are valid, about, well, what if it is a nail salon, which has significant pedestrian traffic? What who knows? So I think stipulating as a condition that it would be an office is going to limit it, like you said, to 2, maybe 3 people if they could fit in 900 square feet.
Okay. And I do have one quick question. I thought about it based on the Bethany Church and what you testified before. If the resident is going to have an extra parking space across the street, and they're required to tell you stuff, are they going to be charged for it? Is that included in their lease?
We'll make sure that it would be included. I can't speak to how the leases are structured, but that is going to be something that's going to be a part of your lease. When you sign a lease, it's going to ask how many vehicles you have, and there's going to be a stipulation that says, to the extent and this changes at any point during your tenancy, please let us know, whether it goes up or goes down.
Okay, I'm satisfied. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Smeraldo. Mr. Cardozo, do you have any questions?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, thank you. Thank you, Ms. Clark and
Clark,
Mr.
on
Wong.
her testimony.
Yeah. To follow up, to piggyback on Mr. Smeraldo's questioning, I believe in our September meeting, I had asked or requested that if the commercial tenants were not going to receive the 2 available parking spaces in the building, that they have access to the Mississippi lot, and I believe that was acknowledged. So just adding that, perhaps neither here nor there. To follow up on Mayor McCartney's question regarding just the orientation of the entrance and exit of the building. Thank you both for your answers. I know Mr. Hazel actually also posed that question in the September meeting, and I would just like to throw it to Mr. Hazel and ask the answers regarding the turn off of Main Street, 90-degree angle, and everything else Mr. Wine and Ms. Clark testified to. Is that sufficient, or was there anything that you would push back against in that?
Yeah, I was actually, patiently waiting for my turn to raise that again, beat the proverbial horse a little more. Yeah, that is an area that's of quite a bit of concern to me. My thinking about it at the time is that I envision that you can have the ingress off of Park Drive North and have an egress only out of the garage onto the main street. and with a right turn only. I mean, that will give you minimal, you don't have to cross the street, you have to turn right only. Because I think that, in my opinion, the impact of having the cars, even though I do agree that it's not going to be a tremendous amount of traffic that will be leaving the building and going around the loop, I think that will have a significant impact on that neighborhood. The roadway is very small, it's tight. There is a tremendous density there. And that is something that has concerned me. And I was wondering if there was not any way that something like that could have been accommodated, an ingress only and an egress out onto Main Street. I know the bus stop is there and things of that sort, but I think the benefit of pursuing something like that is worth actually looking at, even relocating the bus stop a few feet one way or the other. So
And-
yeah, I hope I didn't go too far afoul of what you were asking. But yeah, I have concern about that too, and I'm wondering if doing something of that nature would not be possible.
No, absolutely. Thank you. I couldn't remember the answer when you posed the question at the last meeting. And also, based on what you said, I believe internally that would only mean, potentially losing storage, the storage section of the building, making such an egress.
Yeah, so I can, if we were to do that, and I would definitely, I appreciate the comments. This is where usually I like to play architect and engineer. This is where I'm going to tap out, and I would not, definitively be able to say we could do it. But just, looking at this spatially, Jerry, if we did that, we would end up losing, even if we had a one-way out, we would lose at least one parking space. So
Yeah.
maybe that's the answer. I mean, right? I mean, if it's doable, again, maybe we came in with 13, we grew to 14, we go back to 13 and have an egress out. But I would want to confirm that with my design team, and I would also want to know that that's something the board would prefer to entertain, before endeavoring to look at that.
If that's doable, and I don't know, I would throw it to the chair. I would like to take a kind of a straw poll of the board members based on just questioning that we've heard and concerns about safety. Whether that would be something that we'd like. I don't know. It sounds, based on Mr. Hazel's professional opinion, it sounds like something worth investigating. Your thoughts, Mr. Chairman?
I'm thinking Mr. Klein opined on this and had no problem with it. I see now we were talking about a garage entrance. We were worried about people walking in the cars going in. Now we're going to be worrying about another exit with the cars going out onto a main street. And the speed that cars come around that main street, and as I recall, except for the open parking lots that don't traverse a bus stop. So you have a bus stop, you'd have a parking lot, you're coming through, that would be a pretty big amount of digging through, regrading. I think it would probably change this application a lot.
Okay. My only thought, again, I'm just thinking in real time here, is that also some of the concerns had been, as far as what's currently proposed for the ingress and egress, a lot of the concerns had been raised by the neighbors, the residents, and if the plan currently going forward is for them to have designated permit parking on Park Drive North, and perhaps that also mitigates some of those concerns, because I believe the testimony or the questions from the public had stated that there had been a lot of kind of illegal parking and just overdone, too much parking on Park Drive North, and that was the concern with some of it. So if permit parking can alleviate that, and we don't have the concern about turning directly onto Main Street with a new egress point, then perhaps it's a moot point.
I think, as Mayor McCartney has opined, that the permit parking should take care of the concerns of the people on Main Street. It may also help them with, as they have said, there are people who park on North Park Drive who don't live there. So it would not only free up spaces for the people who live there. It would remove people who don't live there and don't have a permit. And this would take care of the parking for this project. And I think that if you have parking exit on Main Street, you're changing the application a lot. I refer Ms. Clark. What do you think? You're the planner.
Yeah, I would say we obviously need to study that extensively from a technical feasibility standpoint, because there is the substantial grade change. So like right now, those parking spots are sitting, substantially above the parking spots at Front Main Street. There are sitting substantially above the grade of the right of way. So I don't know that we have enough depth to, accommodate the slope that we need even. That would have to be studied by our engineering team. Also, just from a layout perspective, we may
Yeah, I
actually
would continue on with this application. Yeah, I'd continue on this application the way it is. I think we've worked out, and when Mr. Klein was here, he had no issue. So he's not the traffic engineer for the board, but he is a traffic engineer, and he had looked at the application. When we went through that part of the application, he had his questions answered, and he felt that it was reasonable. And again, the biggest issue that the neighbors had opined was the parking.
Yeah, well, thank you for Ms. Clark, Mr. Wine, Mr. Hazel, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for opining with me openly. I am satisfied.
Thank you. Ms. Kopfer, do you have any questions for Ms. Clark on her testimony?
Thank you, Chairman. And yeah, thank you, Ms. Clark. I do have a question. Yeah, I do share the concerns about the parking over at Bethany Church, mainly the crossing Main Street. And I know that, when we had looked at the crossing, even at Dunkin' Donuts, there was a back and forth even, at that point too, about adding a crosswalk there. So the 2 lanes in each direction is tough. But, along the lines of pedestrian safety, just curious if, in your opinion, are there any aspects of the project that you feel would serve to improve pedestrian safety in any way?
Sure. I mean, from the Park Drive North perspective, I think we've had a lot of testimony and kind of gone through an iterative design process with the board in terms of adding the pedestrian safety measures as related to the new curb cut there and the garage entrance and egress. So I do think the warning systems that we are proposing will help to eliminate safety concerns for the new curb cut or the relocated curb cut. I guess the current driveway does feed off of Park Drive North, but we are relocating it. Additionally, I do think that the expanded sidewalk condition that's going to be created with the commercial space, so it's technically within our property, but essentially what we're doing from a design standpoint is expanding the sidewalk up to the storefront, that 5 feet of our front yard. So I do think we're giving kind of a more substantial sidewalk at the front of the property along Main Street, which is also where you have potential congestion issues because it's a rather narrow sidewalk with a bus stop, right? So when you do have people queuing for the bus there, that might create some friction with other pedestrians. So I do think the expanded depth for the majority of the building itself is a benefit to safety. I definitely understand the board's concerns with crossing the county road. Obviously, as Mr. Wine stated, we could explore improved pedestrian crossing safety measures. There are many solutions to these problems. It's not a unique, ask at a county level. I'm in Union County, right next to Essex County, and we have similar conditions in our town with county roads and school locations and such. So obviously crossing is a big concern. We have various projects that have been implemented. Again, different county. I can't really represent what Essex County has done in practice. But there are many strategies, including lighting lit signs that you can push a button when you're ready to cross that can flash to let the cars know. It would probably be a great strategy here because of the higher speed nature of this road versus like a residential street. Additionally, they have flag systems or brick systems where you actually get you keep very bright neon flags at the crossing so that someone can grab it and walk across, and it's just kind of like a big visual cue for cars to slow down well in advance. So there are a lot of solutions that exist. It's just obviously it's not fully within our power to implement those. It requires coordination, but as Mr. Wine said, I don't see why we couldn't get the conversation going, particularly, I believe it was the councilman who said that you do have Vision Zero adopted. You do seem to have substantial policy within the township that helps to kind of be the starting point for that coordination with the county, which is great. And so, I think it's certainly a conversation that I'm sure they're having with many, many communities, particularly Essex County. I mean, this is a very, transit-rich, mixed-use county with high density population areas. So I don't think it would be a conversation that they would be adverse to having. It's just not within our ability as the development, as the applicant to like represent, we can definitively do something across that right of way.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think we would want to see some, and I don't know if this would be who this would be, if this would be you or our pet safety board or somebody having a conversation with the county. If it were to go in the direction of having the spaces at the church. That's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Hazel, do you have any questions for Ms. Clark on her testimony?
Yes, and I'm not sure if this is for Ms. Clark or if it's for Mr. Wine, because he did bring up the option of the getting the spaces at the church. I just wanted to get a little more information about the spaces at the church. Are these going to be 24/7 dedicated spaces, or how is that going to work?
That is being fleshed out. I don't have a full answer on that yet. What I can say definitively is, in speaking to the church, there's no issue with overnight and weekday hours. In full candor, I think the only potential hiccup may be, Sundays. But again, it's absolutely, it's not being foreclosed as the opportunity to have them then anyways. That's something that we're just working through. So bear with me on that, Jerry.
Yeah, because that was my concern, just that any conflict between the spaces that are dedicated to the residents conflicting with the church's functioning with programs and things of that sort, just how that would work out. I would recommend, Mr. Chair, that whether it's a condition of approval or what have you, that some sort of an agreement be provided to the board or to the board's attorney to review and address some of these questions.
For satisfaction.
That the spaces will be identified clearly in perpetuity,
Right.
as long as they are rented by the applicant.
And just, this may not be the right time or venue to say this, but looking at this application and looking at the roadway, looking at the issue of the crossing, this is an extensive stretch of roadway that doesn't have very many crosswalks. As a matter of fact, there's just one that I see. And you have quite a bit of population across on one side of Main Street and on the opposite side, especially with a Dunkin' Donuts there. You're gonna have, especially with the commercial activity that is popping up there, including what potentially could be at this building, you're gonna get the need or the desire to have some walking across that Main Street. And so I think it's something that needs to be looked at on a larger scale, putting some more crosswalks there, maybe the flash ones that will help to slow the traffic down, because I think it would be beneficial to all concerned if that traffic is able to be slowed down a bit, because it does provide somewhat of a speedway going all the way up and nothing to sort of hinder you at all. You don't have a red light or traffic light, you don't have crosswalks and things of that sort. So that's definitely something I think that should be looked at on a wider scale. That's all I have.
Thank you. Mr. Hess, do you have any comments or questions for Ms. Clark on her testimony?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. All of my questions have been asked and answered already, so I have no other questions.
Thank you, Mr. Hess. At this time, we're going to take a 10-minute bio break. Okie dokie. Okie dokie. Okay. Are we back, guys? Everybody back and smiley? Okay. Okay, guys, let's go back on the record. Is Mr. Wine back with us with Ms. Clark? Mr. Wine, welcome back.
Thank you.
Okay. I just want to make sure the rest of the board is with us. Okay. Okay, we're up to the public. Do any members of the public have any questions for Ms. Clark on her testimony? Please raise your hand and be identified. Do any members of the public have any questions for Ms. Clark on her testimony? Please raise your hand and be identified.
Yes, we have several.
Okay.
Susan Lesnick, please state your name and address for the record.
Susan Lenchik, 234 Eagle Rock Avenue, residents of the Park Drive Loop for 49 years. One question I have regards the building as mixed use. Since it is not known whether it be retail space or an office there, and it may be an office, is it possible that an office could simply be the management office for the apartment building?
Well, like from a zoning standpoint, that would be permissible, but I would just offer that typically a building of this size wouldn't need a management office. This is only 12 units, so typically it's, you know, a larger scale project that would necessitate that, where they have more consistent turnover of leases and things of that nature. Ben, you might be able to opine about the intention of the client a little bit more in detail on that.
Yeah, it's certainly an interesting suggestion. Ms. Lenchik, I think a management office is probably, as Mallory said, it's not really, you know, useful in a building of this size. Those are typically in much larger buildings. But you know, it's a good question. I think you stipulating that it will be office to begin with, and we're talking about 900 square feet. Like I alluded to before, this is like, you know, an accountant sitting at a desk with a little area to meet with a client, or, you know, an architect plus a little area to spread out some plans. I mean, that's 900 square feet, especially when you include in there the ADA bathroom, goes pretty quickly.
Okay. Now, can I refer to the document, the justification of variances document?
Mhm.
Okay, now, on page 3, there's a statement, quote, "The proposed project will provide adequate light, air, and open space for the adjacent properties," close quote. How does the project, quote unquote, provide light, air, and open space? Does it radiate sunlight? Blow breezes?
No, so that's actually a clause that's set within municipal land use law. So that's a kind of a technical planning reference within municipal land use laws. Provide just means allow for in this context.
Okay.
Not generate, which I think is the way you're interpreting it, if I'm understanding
Yeah,
that
'cause
correctly.
that's what it says. Anyway,
Mhm.
so now, did you make your judgments on that statement based on the actual site conditions or on diagrams on paper?
Well, both, based on the proposed site conditions with the proposed massing of the structure and then the setbacks on the property.
Okay. Now, did you closely examine the property on the south side of the proposed development? And if so, at what time of year?
So I examined it in plan view, meaning like aerial view from Google. I actually did confirm with the property lines today that set of townhomes, I believe that's the property you're referring to, is that correct?
Yes.
Is set back approximately 5.5 feet from their property line on that same property line. So we do have almost an identical setback on our property line on that shared line.
But did you not notice an extensive perennial garden there that took years of toil and a lot of expense to develop, that significantly and substantially improves the residents' property? And do you not recognize that the improvement would be compromised by the proximity of the proposed building? After all, that space has been open space for 28 years since those people actually have been living there.
I don't have the expertise to definitively say one way or the other what the direct impacts would be on that garden. I don't have knowledge of the extent of that garden or the exact location. That would be, you know, a question for a different expert. Just what I'm really evaluating is the setbacks in comparison to the massing as proposed versus the contemplated requirement within the zoning code. So it's more of that's more numerical. The zoning code doesn't require us to look at site conditions to that level. There's not like a protection in place, for example, in the code for things of that nature.
And Mallory, just a quick follow-up on that. Yeah, I mean, I think you said we're compliant on that side, except for the parking level on the ground floor. Is that right?
Correct. So that's just the ground floor. The upper levels step back an additional 5 feet on that property line, which meets the required 10 feet.
But wait a minute, it's the minimum is 10 feet that's required. And
correct. So we have our ground floor is a little over 5, I believe. I believe it's 5.22 at that point, at the tightest point on that property line. And then that's just for the ground floor. And then the upper floor setback an additional 5 feet. So the floors 2 and 3 step back further.
Right, but the garden is on the ground. It is not up there. And that is very much impacted when you suddenly have a brick wall that blocks all sunlight and airflow. So I would think that even though you're going by generalizations of what code says, this is not just code. These are real people and these are real conditions that are being impacted.
Understood.
Okay. You state on page 5 that the proposed development is consistent with the master plan, specifically that it's compatible with the, quote, suburban character of the township. Do you testify that placing a building a few feet from an adjacent property where there was always open space, light, and airflow is suburban? Isn't it not more urban in nature to have something so close to a residence?
I think it's consistent with the zoning as adopted by the township within this specific zone. So meaning that the mixed use prototype is a permissible use within the property. And I think that there's many references within the master plan that reference the expansion of mixed-use development in commercial districts. So I understand your concern about the residential property, but the property itself is within a commercial zone, not a residential zone.
Yeah, on Main Street, it's commercial, but the whole block that it's affecting is residential. So, I mean, that's a point that should be considered. Okay, on page 5, you refer to the project as one that promotes the establishment of appropriate population densities and concentrations that will contribute to the well-being of the persons. So how does, considering the current density of the Park Drive loop and vicinity, which has led to parking and safety concerns, how does the project establish appropriate population density and specifically contribute to the well-being of that neighborhood?
So again, when we're looking at these purposes of the municipal land use law in comparison to the zoning, we're looking at the zoning of the property at hand. So again, those residential properties and their associated densities are subject to different zoning standards and different density standards. We're not subject to the same zoning. The standards that are set forth and contemplated, as I spoke to in my testimony, is that the mixed use provision doesn't set a density standard. It's really just allowing for the multifamily use above the ground floor, and we are consistent with that. And we are consistent in terms of the number of units we're proposing within our building footprint is very reasonable from my perspective. And really what I mean by that is that we have generous units. So instead of trying to just cram as many units as possible at a smaller scale within this footprint, we've really thoughtfully laid out a lesser number of units at a more comfortable size, which I think is really striking a balance of appropriate density for the site and neighborhood.
And how does blocking the winter sunlight, because it's such a big building and it's right practically right up to the street on Park Drive North, it blocks winter sunlight on the bottom very steep portion of Park Drive North, creating more slippery conditions because the sun is not going to hit that part of the road for vehicles attempting to travel up the road, and then they have to stop and get stuck while somebody's exiting the garage, and then risk being struck by vehicles turning up the road because that's a blind corner. How does this contribute to the well-being of that neighborhood?
I'm sorry, can you clarify your question for me? Because you were talking about sunlight and then about stopping.
The building is so big and it's so close and it's so tall, it is blocking, and the sun is further south in the winter. So that bottom portion of Park Drive North that's very steep is not going to have any sunlight to melt anything that freezes on the street. And so it's going to be very difficult for vehicles that are.
Ma'am, you're testifying. You can ask a question of Ms. Clark.
Well, I was asking.
Ma'am, listen to me, please. You can ask a question of Ms. Clark, but we have to focus. If you start adding information that is not in evidence by an expert, it's testimony. I'm asking you, please, to work within the guidelines. Ask her a question.
The question was, how does that situation contribute to the well-being of the neighborhood?
So again, the situation is speculative. I cannot affirm or deny what the sun conditions will be. I have not, nor do I think our team has produced a shadow study on the property, nor is that a requirement of the ordinance. What I can tell you is that from a bulk perspective, we are conforming height. So we're not an overly tall building that's going to have an abnormal impact on sunlight from a directional standpoint in terms of our building height overall. That's really all I can say from the information that I have definitively.
Okay. Now, in reference
Sorry,
to
your time is up.
Ma'am, thank you. One more question and then it'll be it. Thank you, ma'am. One more question, please.
In reference to your statement on page 3, that the proposed structure, quote, is appropriate in scale compared to the surrounding context along the Main Street corridor, unquote, is it not true that the building that you refer to was built about 100 years ago when conditions and needs along the Main Street corridor were very different in terms of transportation and parking than they are today?
I'm sorry, I don't understand your question exactly. What do you mean the building? I'm So that
Well-
statement is in reference to the proposed project.
Yes, it says it's appropriate in scale compared to the surrounding context along the Main Street corridor. That's a quote directly from your report.
Mhm.
So now the question is it not true that the building that you're referring to about that surrounding context was built 100 years ago? And so the conditions then were different from, or not the conditions then, or were they not different than they are today? So how can that statement really be made?
So Chairman, can I just, and I hate to do this, but can I just,
Mr. Wine, go right ahead.
yeah, I'm not gonna object. I think Ms. Lenchik, I would just like you to ask Ms. Clark first the question as what she considers the surrounding neighborhood or surrounding context, and not just conclude that she's talking about one particular building, if that's okay.
Oh, okay. All right. So you asked that question. That's it then. What is the surrounding context then?
So in terms of the appropriate bulk analysis, again, I think I covered that, to some extent in my testimony and looking at the other mixed-use commercial properties in the area, particularly the project directly across the street at the other corner of Park Drive North. We're very much in keeping with scale and orientation to the sidewalk as that building, in addition to the other mixed-use buildings along the Main Street corridor that have ground floor commercial with some residential space above. We are consistent, and I would just offer, I think, based on the second part of that question that you asked, just because something was built a long time ago doesn't mean that the context isn't relevant today. The existing framework of the neighborhood is the existing framework of the neighborhood, and that's what I think that we've responded to appropriately and with the scale of the project.
Okay, thank you very much for your question. Does anybody else have a question for Ms. Clark on her testimony? Please raise your hand and be identified.
Yes, we have Love Gaylord. Please state your name and address for the record.
Good evening. Excuse me, my name is Love Gaylord. I live at 31 Park Drive North here in town.
Go
Okay.
right ahead.
All
Go
right.
ahead. Thank you. Ask your question, please.
Okay, I want to thank you all for the audience first. Ms. Clark, again, I'm so sorry I missed the introductions. I sincerely apologize. If I'm asking you anything that you may have to repeat, I apologize.
No problem.
Ms. Clark, what is your expertise again?
I'm a licensed planner in the state of New Jersey since 2021, and I have a background in landscape architecture and urban planning and design in New York and New Jersey particularly.
Okay. Well, there's several things for several people I'd like to ask, but Ms. Clark, one of the things you said when someone asked you, did you come out and look at the property for some purpose? And you said you looked at a Google view. And I don't know, you went to school, and I guess it's okay in your field, but it doesn't seem like it's okay for the township of West Orange. I'll give you an example. It's supposed to be a question, right? Here's the question.
Yeah, I can actually
Okay.
answer that
Go
question.
ahead.
So I have been to the site. I have walked the neighborhood. That has been part of our review. I was just explaining something to her that was in relationship of a building to a property line, which is something that would need documentation in an electronic form to analyze. I wasn't trying to. I apologize if that came across that I have not visited the site, but I want to be clear, as part of my site visit, I'm visiting the subject property and then experiencing things from the public realm. I'm not able to go onto another property to understand a condition.
Okay, so let me ask you another question. Dad, I have a list here and I got off track, sorry, a bit, about coming to the property and the quality of life. Now, let me ask you, have you or your team driven around the township of West Orange to see what the landscape is in our neighborhood and around the town and how it has been changing or not changing? Have you seen the landscape of West Orange as a whole?
I am familiar with West Orange as a community. I live nearby and utilize businesses and services in the town. Also, I have handled other applications before the zoning board. Not that this is my first time before the planning board, but I have an active application before the zoning board, so I'm familiar with it from a zoning perspective and from a
Zoning perspective. Okay.
from a navigability standpoint as well.
What I'm trying to get at is the landscape. Has it been considered by your developer, the person who employed you? Has the landscape has that been considered as far as the way everything else looks and how the landscape is? Because what I know from other townships is that there are zoning and ordinances and rules that don't get me, I don't know.
Excuse me, we're gonna focus on West Orange. So you ask a question about
Okay.
West Orange this project. Thank you.
Okay, I'm sorry. This is it's a little difficult to formulate the question while you're trying to explain what you're talking about. I will
You're
try to
doing
get
great.
back focused.
You are
Okay,
doing great. Thank you.
okay, because I don't want to run out of time. Okay, so the landscape. I'm just concerned about the mismatch of the landscape. Are you aware that we are opposite of a national park?
Sorry, you mean the property itself, or are you saying the community as a whole?
Well, the property and the community, we all together right here. Are you aware that we are adjacent, or, right opposite of a national park?
No, but can you clarify what if you're talking about our specific piece of land, or you
Yes,
do mean
yes.
West Orange?
The Welland Park is right behind us, and this whole neighborhood is the what's the Thomas Edison factory neighborhood, and Thomas Edison is considered it's a national park. I just want to know, were you aware of the historic significance of this particular area where your developer wants to build this very different structure? Are you aware of it? Is your developer aware that this is a national park area?
Mallory, to the extent you can answer that, go ahead.
Yeah, I can't represent what the developer is aware of. I can tell you that we look at green space connections typically within certain pedestrian circumferences in these kinds of projects. What I can tell you is in terms of how the site is developed, we're looking at the zoning of the subject property and what's
Okay.
permissible per the zoning code.
Okay, so zoning is on paper, and like another person said, not considering the quality of life of the humans who actually live in this area. I thought this was a time for testimony. I didn't know it was a time for actual questions. I'm most concerned about the quality of life. How about the school buses? You said someone said they might consider moving the bus stop. It's a very active 3 or 4 bus stops in this 2 or 3 blocks with school buses. Have you considered the safety of the children? What are you going to do about the school buses that come PM and AM and the children in movement, people walking their dogs? It's a very busy area, very sensitive populations that are traveling most of the day.
So Miss Gaylord, I'll let Miss Clark answer. I think, and this may be your first time on, but we did have a traffic engineer present testimony, and that may have been better suited to him.
I thank you so much. I've been on this before, but every time that I'm on, most things are not answered. They're saying we're still trying to hash it out. I've been on, this is my 4th time, and I don't feel any more convinced that any of the important things have been answered fully. So that's why I'm asking again, hoping to get an answer. And I'm not the only one that keeps asking the same question in different ways.
So Mallory, to the extent you can answer, beyond what the traffic engineer has.
As the project is currently proposed, there is not an impact on the existing bus stop. I think there was discussion earlier by some of the commissioners as to whether exploring a different design alternative of the site that would necessitate an adjustment or a relocation in terms of shifting the bus stop would be.
Excuse me, it's not just a bus stop for the city bus, it's a school bus stop as well for all the grades. It's a tiered bus stop, so it's a lot of buses.
Yeah, I understand but the bus stop in terms of how we're talking about it for the site is a designated zone with designated limits. So again, as we are proposing the project, that would not need to move. But I think there was discussion on whether it was a possibility to shift that based on different design alternatives. I don't think we've landed anywhere conclusively at this point of time if that's the preferred the preference of the board or not, but the current project as proposed does not move or impact the current bus stations.
Thank you, Dr. R. Last question. I don't want to say your last name wrong, Dr. Robert.
Oh, right ahead. Thank you.
Okay, Dr. Robert, you made a statement, and I'm not sure if it was part of some other thing, but you said that it sounded like you were recommending for the developer, the representatives here, to proceed with the application as it is. Is that what you said?
Yes, proceed with the application as it is.
And though we still have lots of questions not answered, we should all still proceed. The community should go along with it.
No. What I said was one of the board members had asked if they would change the egress of the garage to Main Street, as opposed to changing the entire project, the entire application. The application will go ahead with the information provided with the ingress and egress off of North Park Drive.
So you're talking about one part of it, not as a whole. You're saying that part of
Correct.
the application?
Yeah,
Oh,
all I said was we're going to continue hearing the application. We're going to continue hearing the public's comments.
oh,
We're just not going to ask the applicant to redo the whole application.
well, okay. Well, then I guess that's it. But they should redo the whole design because it doesn't match and it's not respectful to the town. I'm done. Thank you.
But thank you very much. Do any other members of the public have any questions for Ms. Clark on her testimony? Please raise your hand and be identified.
Yes, we have MK Adams. Please state your name and address for the record.
Well, thank you, Meg. You've already stated my name, MK Adams, Park Drive South. Ms. Clark, thank you very much for your testimony. I do have a whole bunch of questions. First, I wanted to say thank you to Mr. Alper for bringing up the slides you showed about the other downtown redevelopment standards. But isn't it misleading to try and overlay those standards into what is strictly a B2 zone for this property?
No, I think that was kind of my point of the exercise, is that the B2 has not contemplated any kind of adjusted bulk standards for this conditional use for the mixed use prototype. So typically when you have a conditional use, or many times when you have a conditional use within a zone, and what that means, as I discussed, is that the zone, you're contemplating a use that the zone wasn't inherently written for.
Right.
The way the bulk standards were set. And so absent of adjusted bulk standards, it's what I think that exhibit tried to show was that it's not really viable to meet the bulk standards of a wildly different site configuration from a building footprint standpoint. And so we looked at where this conditional use is fully fleshed out and fully contemplated within the township's ordinance to understand what both this board and the governing body has adopted as acceptable bulk standards for a mixed-use building.
Right, but those acceptable standards are for other zones, isn't that correct?
They're for other zones that contemplate the same mixed use. And again, I think I touched on in my testimony how we believe we've scaled that in terms of we're not just taking every metric of that as like, oh, well, this is appropriate. We've proposed essentially half the height within our project and number of stories as those zones contemplate, because we didn't think that would be appropriate at this location. So I think
doesn't that seem like putting the apples in the orange section?
No, to me, I think it's an appropriate analysis for the board to understand the relationship of the relief we're requesting compared to the use that's permitted within the zone.
So you did use the mixed use typology phrase quite a bit, and I appreciated that map of other mixed use buildings in this section of Main Street. My question is, although you said that there's no base requirement, what is the proportion of the commercial spaces of those buildings that you made purple in relation to the residential units that are in each of those buildings?
Yes, so that's a great question, and I'll actually share my screen again to one of the exhibits that we previously went through just to clarify for you. Just give me 1 second.
Well, no, I mean, I saw your slides. What I'm asking, what is the current ratio of 410 Main Street's plan of the commercial use proportion to the residential use in total square footage?
In total square footage, I don't have that number offhand. I'd need a few minutes to run that calculation.
Well,
Because again,
because it's on the plans, it's 3.5%. That's the ratio. So the 900 square feet of commercial use, commercial space in this building is 3.5% of the total square footage of 410. And I'm asking you, what is the proportion in those buildings that you highlighted for comparison? What is the proportion of the ground floor retail as opposed to how many units are above those retail spaces?
I don't have that number prepared for you tonight. Again, there's explanation to the analysis in the exhibit that basically, based on my evaluation of each property, assumes a uniform proportion of the commercial space, unless it was very clearly delineated from the public realm that there was a different proportion, meaning unless it was very clear from the sidewalk, that there were 3 businesses within that footprint versus 1 business within a footprint, then I adjusted for that. But otherwise, everything was assumed at 90% of the ground floor of every building. I can't represent the inner workings of every single property. I don't have access within every building, so I don't know how much residential space is on the ground floor of every building. I'm only able to access what any other member of the public is able to access in walking into a business and walking out. So I don't have the ability to provide that number.
In your expertise, just looking at, say, one of the buildings that you had in purple, a couple hundred feet away from 410 Main, had it had a shoe repair retail space. Just by looking at that, you can make an estimate of what the residential to commercial ratio is, can't you?
No, as a professional, I'm not in the habit of making estimates and testifying to them. I would represent things that I'm able to put concrete data behind. So I don't think that would be appropriate for me to do.
Thank you. So, Ms. Lenchek had brought up that on page 3, the appropriate in scale compared to the surrounding context along the Main Street corridor. And do you know how many units, how many residential units are in that building at the northwest corner of Park Drive, North and Main?
No, unfortunately, I did pull the tax card for that property, and it did not have a unit count on the tax card, so I'm not able to definitively say.
Does it have the square footage of that building as opposed to the one you're proposed or your client is proposing?
No, they don't propose. That's something that is only conveyed on an actual survey for an individual property. They only provide the overall site size on publicly available data.
From those of us who live there, it's double that your building is double the size. So
yeah, but our property is also significantly bigger than that property.
Just in units provided. On page 2, you write that the project proposes an appropriate building envelope and configuration consistent with mixed-use properties throughout much of the township's downtown. Which other properties in West Orange use a pedestrian alarm?
Oh, I can't speak to every design feature of every property, but it's a very common practice in mixed use or multifamily buildings to use a pedestrian alarm system for a garage. I've handled hundreds of applications that have used that technology.
Right, and that might be very well suited in Jersey City or Union, but I'm asking about West Orange.
Again, this is my first time before the planning board for this type of project, so I can't speak to that. Would be something more appropriate for the town's planner to respond to as to whether that's common practice here or not.
Okay. On page 3, too, you write the proposed setback is consistent. This is in the minimum rear yard setback. The last sentence, the proposed setback is consistent with side yard setbacks seen along the Park Drive corridor. But this isn't a Park Drive property. This is a Main Street property. So what are the consistent distances in a rear yard setback for Main Street buildings in the B2 zone?
In the B2 zone, so again, I have not specifically conducted that analysis, so I can't represent a number to you. What the reason that we reported the Park Drive North condition is because that's what the shared property line is at that property line. So that property line is relating to the adjacent zone and adjacent use of the lower density single family zoning. And so that's what I was speaking to in that. The relationship, it depends on the property for other mixed use projects within the B2 zone. Some of them, the majority of them back up to either each other at the corner of Harrison and Main Street or to large swaths of parking. You can, if you are, obviously you're familiar with the area at the corner of Harrison and Main Street, close to the Elks Lodge and the senior facility. So
Those have
the
exterior
B2
parking
zone,
behind them.
correct.
Right. So
So
it's
again, the analysis was done based on the shared property line. So it was looking at the immediately adjacent property that would be impacted by the building bulk along that portion of the lot.
Ma'am, this will be your last question, please.
It's actually, we established way back in June that there is no time limitation for questions. I can ask one, but then I reserve the right to come back. We are acting as pro se attorneys in this case, Dr. Bagoff. So, my question to you then is, and then I'll pass it on to somebody else. How does a 900 square foot office, an architecture's office, I think is what was proposed this evening, how does that activate downtown redevelopment and justify all these mixed use considerations and variance requests?
So typically, just as a standard urban design principle, any level of commercial space is going to activate a street front more so than, say, traditional residential on a street frontage. Additionally, I think from a design perspective, as stated, we have really pulled the sidewalk into the property to connect this particular site with the public realm much more than the existing condition, because the existing condition is that the property is elevated several feet and separated by a retaining wall. So the property is completely cut off from Main Street in the current condition. I think we're improving that. Again, the proposed commercial space is anchored at the corner, which also helps to just activate the street frontage. I'd see this as a benefit from the existing site condition, absolutely, from an urban design perspective in terms of impact on overall street vitality.
One more quick question related to the commercial space, and then I will yield to my neighbor. You had said that for commercial parking, it would be one space per 250 square feet. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm. Correct, yes.
Would that constitute 3.5 or so parking spaces for this commercial space?
So it would be 4 spaces for parking. It was 3.6, so round up to the 4 required spaces. Per state statutes, the project gets credit for 2 required spaces because we are implementing EV wired spaces, which is like an energy efficiency program the state runs. So that reduces that to 2.
Okay, thank you. I'll be back. Thank you.
Thank you. Do any other members of the public have any questions for Ms. Clark on her testimony? Please raise your hand and be identified.
Yes, we have William Mills. Please state your name and address for the record. William? You're muted. Okay, we'll come back to William.
Okay. Do any other members of the public have any questions for Ms. Clark? Please raise your hand and be identified.
Yes, we have Joe Middleton. Joe, state your name and address for the record.
Hello, can you hear me?
Oh,
yes.
Yeah.
Go right ahead,
Yes.
sir.
Okay, yeah. My name is Joe Middleton. I live at 4 Ashwood Terrace. I have 2 questions, but I think MK Adams asked the second. But the question that I still have is, you mentioned the agreement with Bethany Church, and I wanted to know what would be the term of that parking agreement. Would it be at least 5 years, and would you guys be continued that you have to have an ongoing agreement with another facility, or could you just after the first year let the agreement lapse and the building's built and all is done?
I'm going to let our attorney answer that. I think he's more appropriate to respond to the question, Mr. Middleton.
Okay.
Yeah, so I'm sorry, yeah, Mr. Middleton, I'm sorry, I missed your name. So yeah, we haven't put together a formal agreement in place as of yet. However, this would be, the goal is for this to be indefinite. I want to bring back the traffic testimony was that we really don't think the data would not support that we would need it. What this is a fail-safe after a fail-safe, whereby if for whatever reason we did go over the 14 space need, and for whatever reason there happened to not be available at that time, that month, an extra space in the municipal lot, then and only then we'd end up in this scenario whereby we could take up to 10 additional spaces. Through my conversation with the pastor, with the attorney for the pastor, the understanding that we have in place at this point is that they take no exception to simply providing us these spaces. I understand, I'm not going to say in perpetuity, but there's no time limit on this. What is not going to happen though is it's not going to be we're going to rent out 10 spaces every month in perpetuity, because if we don't need them, which our testimony and the data would support that we won't need them, then we would rent 0 spaces. It's just a fail-safe after a fail-safe.
Okay. I'm a little concerned. I live on Ashwood Terrace. I don't know if any other the residents are on Ashwood Terrace, and I know this street gets some overflow of parking from other streets, and I'm sure including Park North, because there's a person's car that I know specifically lives on Park North that I've found his car parked in front of my home on several occasions. So I think that's certainly a concern. My other question, I was a little thrown off by the testimony, similar to MK Adams, in relation to how she compared the building standards to other zoning areas. So my question to her is, do you think that our zoning restrictions are unreasonable or ill-informed? Why did she feel the need to introduce those zoning regulations as opposed to the zoning ones here that are clearly defined?
When you say those zoning, do you mean like the exhibits I shared with the comparison to the other mixed
Correct.
use?
Correct.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
it's not that the zoning is ill-informed. I just don't think it's a fully baked component of the ordinance. I think I've testified at this point that typically when you introduce a conditional use that has significant implications on how a site functions from a circulation standpoint or a building standpoint, you will have a new set of bulk standards that come with that conditional use. This conditional use doesn't contemplate the use that in that manner. So I think it's kind of more that the township's taken the first step. And you know, my professional opinion would be that the next step would be to look at what are the appropriate bulk standards for a mixed use building in these zones under that conditional use. And that's just why, again, I provided the comparison as to this is what the township has deemed appropriate elsewhere in the town. So this is when you're looking at this exact use and building typology on a site in the town, this is what you have deemed as a comfortable and appropriately scaled building, and how that relates to what we're proposing tonight.
Yeah, but isn't that sort of putting the cart before the horse? Shouldn't that regulation be changed first before we consider putting a building up to meet a standard that doesn't exist?
I can't speak as to why something was done sequentially the way it was. All I can say is that the conditional use is adopted within the zoning, so we are entitled to propose the use and we are entitled to request the relief. And I think we've given substantial testimony as to why the relief is needed and why we believe it's reasonable given the permitted use of the site.
One other question, and I don't know if you can answer it. Has there been a consideration to shrink the size of the building to meet the regulations?
Again, I think part of that exhibit was to show that if we were to be compliant with the bulk standards, we wouldn't have a viable mixed use project. So we wouldn't be proposing the application that we're proposing here tonight if we were to comply. I think we would come with the straight zoning, the commercial use solely on the site, and we don't think that that's a better alternative for the site. We think that the mixed use building is the better project.
Okay, those are my questions. Thank you.
Great. Mr. Mills, please state your name and address for the record.
William Mills, 11 Park Drive North.
Great.
Resident here since 1998. Yeah, I have several questions. I'm kind of piggybacking off the last gentleman. And if you don't feel like your building will comply with the way our area is spec'd, maybe your building doesn't belong in our area. Has that occurred to you? Maybe you're trying to have an elephant in a pen that's made for a dog?
I think I've provided substantial testimony as to why we think the bulk we're proposing is consistent with this building typology in the township, and why we think it's a reasonable application given the permitted use within the zoning.
Right, but could it be that why you think that is because that is what you're being paid to think? Are you actually being paid right now?
Yeah,
I'm
Mr.
giving
Middle-
my
Mr. Middle, Miss, I'm sorry, Mr. Mills. I'll let Miss McGovern answer. I don't know if that's an appropriate question.
Oh, no, it's a very appropriate question because she's here. And if she's here and she's on somebody's dime, she's representing that person. She's not here to necessarily speak for what's best for the residents who are now speaking what's best for us.
All of the
She's here to speak for the
professionals are
person.
here, excuse me, sir. All
Okay,
of the
Mr. McGovern.
professionals are being paid for their services here. The board
Okay.
experts, the applicant's attorney, this expert, that is a known factor.
Okay, then I just want that to go into the record that there could be possible bias because of its paid testimony as opposed to the other people who are not being paid and are here because we're concerned about our family and our friends and our lifestyle and our neighborhood and West Orange community as a whole. I wanted to come back to the other question, and I'm not sure this has been answered completely. The parking at the church. So right now, this is just basically a conversation. There's no actual agreement. There's nothing that you can present to say, yeah, you're saying we can have up to 10 sites, 10 spaces. There's probably may not be okay on Sunday, which is one of the times I notice our neighborhood is most crowded when people are not at work on like a Sunday. So is there actually an agreement with the church, or is this just a vague discussion at this point?
So there is a framework. What I indicated before, and I'm happy to respond again. There's not going to be an agreement that says you have 10 spaces because A, we don't believe we're going to need 10 spaces, and B, we wouldn't want to hamstring, our building operator or the church into providing 10 spaces when they're not necessary. So if what you're asking for is a black letter contract that says it's 10 spaces at X amount of dollars, X amount of time, it's just what I'm trying to say to you, and I'm not trying to be confrontational. It's not realistic because if we don't need the 10 spaces, we're not going to pay for the 10 spaces.
And is the need for the 10 spaces based upon how many vehicles are owned by the residents or leased by the residents, or is it based on someone's opinion of how many spaces are needed?
No, it's based on the actual need based on the residents of the building. I didn't testify. Attorneys don't do that. As I put on the record before, there will be a lease provision in every lease to any tenant who will occupy this building, requiring that they disclose the number of vehicles, and it will be upon the building operator to ensure that the spaces are provided. The first space will be in the building. The second space may also be in the building if there's the availability to do that, if there's a need for it. Any subsequent spaces would be either through the municipal parking lot, again, as provided by the building owner, or at the church as provided by the building owner.
Okay, so to be clear, what you're saying is based on the number of cars, if there's more cars from the people who are tenants in the building than there are spaces in the building, then those spaces will be available through the church.
Or through the municipal parking lot. Yes.
Okay, all right. I'm not going to touch on the safety of and the convenience of people going back and forth across the street on that because I think it's already been covered extensively by other people. So I'd like to move on to another question, and it was brought up about permit parking for the residents of the Park Drive loop. I'd like to hear more about what that means. Does that mean I, as a resident, and all the residents will have parking permits to park on the Park Drive loop, and other people, including the new tenants of the new proposed building, will not have those permits?
Hang on one second. Miss McGovern, the mayor, I think, is in discussions with the people in the area that has not been testified to by Miss Clark.
That's right.
So
This isn't part of the testimony, sir. These questions are, or this question in particular, is, it's actually, I guess, we're directed towards an agreement between the neighborhood and I guess people in the administration, mayor and others. So
Chairman, okay,
It
Diana,
came up
may I?
during the testimony, so I just wanted some clarification on that because it is part of the consideration overall.
I understand.
I'm going to ask that. Can we ask the mayor to opine for a minute?
Yes, yes, I would love to. The conversation I started was with the police department. And I wanted to make this a condition of this application that the residents, current residents on the loop would have parking permits.
And I'm glad you were in contact with the police department so they would begin enforcing then on the Park Drive loop, the illegal parking that is so prevalent on our street. If any of you ever care to take a drive around our loop.
Okay, sir, no testifying, please.
I was just giving you the information, conversation I had with the police department.
Okay. Excellent. Thank you, sir.
Someone had mentioned, I think it was Mr. Wine, self-policing of the parking. It would be, the policy would be a self-policing policy. Do you believe actually in self-policing and that's really more like no policing?
No, so I'll clarify. That's not that's not the context in which I said it. What I said is it will be policed by the building in that, as I indicated before, you are required as a tenant to put on your application how many vehicles you have, and there will be a further line in there that says if that changes, either it increases or it decreases, you're required to let management know. That is a material term of the lease agreements that will be in place. What I said was self-policing is that if somebody is, somebody has 5 cars, if somebody's a car collector, they're not going to rent one of these units knowing that they'll get one space in the building and have to figure out where to put their 4 additional cars. So it's self-policing in that sense. The other way it's self-policing is that, again, if you are kind of on the fence, if you're a tenant and you're on the fence as to whether or not you should get a second vehicle or not, you'll have to understand that it's going to be something that you have to stipulate and let management know and be worked out for you. So that's the context. It's not self-policing in a sense of anybody who has a car is going to have to decide whether or not to, police the situation.
Okay. And I'm coming back to Mr. Alper's comment earlier.
Sir, this is going to be your last question because we're going to call the meeting, but go right ahead, sir.
Okay. So again, Ms. Clark had mentioned, she was comparing where we are with other areas in West Orange. But again, I just wanted to point out to her, as she kept saying, this is appropriate that those areas she's talking about do not have single family homes adjacent to the buildings that she's talking about, like our area does. So I disagree that is appropriate.
Okay, thank you very much, sir. So at this time, the hour is late, and we have covered a lot of territory. And from what I understand, Mr. Wine, we'd like to carry this meeting to the regular meeting on December 4th. Is that acceptable to you and your applicant?
Let me confirm, most importantly, with Ms. Clark, because she is still on the clock, so to speak.
Go right ahead, and I'll do some administrative stuff while you guys.
Yeah, let me give her a quick call. I'll be right back.
Okay, and we'll be right here. Okay, so for the members of the planning board and our experts, we have sent out the regular meeting of the planning board for 2025 and the SPRAB meeting for 2025. We'll be looking at that between now and next Wednesday special meeting when we will adopt it. So please look at any dates that you feel need to be moved and speak to Yamilet. Otherwise, we will look at it again next Wednesday and adopt them. The stormwater management videos, you have to look at them with popcorn and the favorite beverage of your choice. Make sure you sign off and send that back to Yamilet immediately, please. Definitely before the meeting next Wednesday. I would like to have every member of the planning board have looked at that and told us how wonderful it is. There'll be a quiz. Okay. The next regular planning board meeting will be held on December 4th, 2024 at 7:30 p.m. via Zoom. And the next special meeting of the planning board will be held November 13th, 2024 at 6:30 p.m. In person in Town Hall. And we're still waiting for Mr. Wine. So don't go
Dr.
away.
Bagoff, I want to remind you, I think you wanted to do an executive session to discuss personnel
Yes.
next
Okay,
week.
So we're going to add that to the, so between 6:30 and 7 next Wednesday, we will have we will go into executive session, and Ms. McGovern and I will talk about personnel and go from there. And Mr. Wine has returned, sir.
Yes. So yeah, December 4th works for myself and Miss Clark. So we are good to go.
Okay, so to that end, PB 24-06-410 Main Street Holdings LLC, Block 113, Lot 262-246-308, 410 Main Street will be carried to the December 4th, 2024 regular planning board meeting. No additional notice will be required.
Thank you, Chairman.
Do I have a motion to adjourn?
So
You're
moved.
very
Mr.
welcome, Mr. Wine.
Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Clark. Thank you, members of the public. We appreciate
Okay,
all
before
your
everybody
input.
logs off, I just want to remind all of our planning board volunteers to respond to your invitation for the extra mile presentation on November 12th, next Tuesday, council meeting.
Okay.
A way to recognize your volunteer efforts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mayor McCartney. I make a motion to adjourn the meeting. Do I have a second?
So moved, Mr. Chairman.
Vice Chairman Garino seconds. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes are above the nose. Thank you very much, all. Have a wonderful evening.